Alright, so since I can't seem to stay out of Stephen King territory, naturally this one was inevitable, I think. So, obviously here we're dealing with his whole concepts of two innocent girls that are given immeasurable and destructive power, pretty much entirely against their will, and eventually they are made into monsters by the not-so-supernatural people around them. So, obviously, you can take this all the way back to the old thing of who's ultimately worse in monster movies between man and monster. It's that old thing, basically. But in a surprisingly human way. Obviously, we talked a lot about King, particularly last year. And one of the things that just always continues to fascinate me about him is how he's able to take all these certain things and like these really big horror stories and all these really weird sort of supernatural elements and basically being able to turn anything into a monster or anything into something frightening. But it's always coming from like this real and human place, and I think that's how he's able to kind of has been able to get into the fears of so many people for so many years and basically be considered a master of that. Is finding that thing that's just like really relatable at the core of just any one person, and then be able to build the fear on that, and with that real foundation underneath it, can make it feel significantly more, like the horror of it feels significantly more real as well. So, I think, and what's interesting about Carrie is the fact that it was basically his first novel. It's his first published novel, as far as I know. But as far as the human element of it and how much that goes, because obviously Carrie has a lot of iconic imagery in it, and it always makes me wonder when I revisit King's stories, just how many people remember how human-driven these stories are. And we'll talk about how De Palma did that in a very De Palma's made a very De Palma movie out of this story while making it a pretty accurate representation of the book. And Mark L. Lester, who's more of like, well, De Palma definitely has his style that we know. Even though a lot of his style is taken from other directors, there's still that something about De Palma where you can still kind of tell that it's him, even regardless of all his homages, many of which are present here especially. Whereas Mark L. Lester kind of feels more like he's like sort of a director for hire type, where it's like, I think one of the most notable things on his resume is Commando. So when you want to talk about people being able to find the humanity, and you can, it depends on how you look at De Palma. Like, when you look at the opening scene of Carrie, it seems like it might be the usual De Palma sleaze, which is another thing that he's kind of known for. And when we're talking De Palma, it's hard to say sleaze and mean it in a negative way. Like, it sounds like it has a negative connotation, but when you're talking about De Palma, it's a bit of a different thing if you know his style, and how you feel about his style. But what's interesting about this is that even though you could equate that to what we know about De Palma as a filmmaker and what he does and his style, there is something really horrifying here about the opening scene. And once again, the person that has the supernatural ability that ultimately becomes the monster of the movie, if you want to say. We'll get more into the why that's a gray area. But just in the meantime, going in with the knowledge that we have of the vague outline of the story, the reason this opening scene is terrifying has nothing to do with the horror that this person could potentially cause, but what's being done to them by this group of people that have no power whatsoever except the power of clicks, I guess. And yeah, while it's definitely hard to watch in the movie, and you can really see just how overwhelming it is, the way it's shot and everything, and how it's almost like the girls become a tidal wave to her, a tidal wave of just humiliation and laughter. Even Sue, who gets like very briefly corrupted, but just enough to make the difference of the whole story. I had, like, whenever I read the book, I have a significant amount of trouble. Like, I read the beginning of the book once, and anytime I've gone back to it, I just skip the beginning because it's, like, way too... And I mean this as a compliment, but I just can't, like, it's too difficult. Like, it's too almost brutal in the sense and cruel. that I came to, and there's just so the way Carrie's like so pathetic and unknowing in this scenario is just really really hard to read. Like I said, you're barely able to watch it the way Sissy Spacek plays it. But I always found that portion of the book like really really tough to get through because it's portrayed so well, and to have that be the start of what is essentially a horror story, when it's something that's coming from a very real place and a humiliation that girls can have at that age, says a lot about this. And talking about Space's performance in general, I can see where it would be. I have no idea like how people felt about it like when it first came out or how they feel about it compared to the book. But I mean, especially lately, people seem to get really bent out of shape over like appearances matching what they are in the book and stuff like that. Like, you know, Tom Cruise's height for Jack Reacher or whatever. I don't know how people felt about the fact that Carrie was initially like chunky and like covered in pimples, and Sissy Spacek is not that. In fact, Sissy Spacek is actually like, well, she's not traditionally attractive compared to like, you know, the other girls around her. She still is, but she also has that case of she just seems like anybody that you would know personally that you went to school with. That's just kind of like seen as an outcast, and there's like real emotion in there, like when we see these moments of pain and where she's coming from, especially after her interactions with her mom, even though the supernatural starts to come in, and obviously when she reacts, her power reacts. But even though the supernatural element is in it at that point, there's still something so real about like the pain that she clearly feels and the way that she plays that. And it is worth noting that despite the kind of movie this is, being not only like, you know, a prime De Palma movie, but also a horror movie, both Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie got Oscar nominations, and it's easy to see, like even kind of busting out of the genre and the kind of movie it is, how they were able to score those. Is easy to see when you actually see what's going on here. And if you want to talk about the different directions these characters are coming from as far as performance go, because it is very interesting that they both got nominated, because their performances are coming from two completely different places because of the characters. Because we were talking about how real and like how the real pain you can feel through Space's performance, and there's also the way she kind of has the whole naive vibe about her, where it's like she's clearly, her powers have like always been there, and she's familiar with them, but they're still, to where like when they happen, like when the ashtray flips, she's not phased by it, but she's still kind of trying to figure out what exactly it is, but it's been there long enough that she knows when it's going to happen. But all of that still feels like, you know, any other real person that you would know that's just curious about something, something about themselves, especially, you know, obviously can be a whole allegory here with, you know, teenagers and growing and all that. But on the other side of this, we have Margaret, her mother, who, while there's a lot of shitty people there's a lot of shitty people, and there is a character, the main character with the really destructive powers. I don't know if anybody could ever walk away from this movie not realizing that Margaret is obviously the villain of this movie, in the whole story. And while Sissy Spacek found that sort of real place to bring Carrie out of, Piper Laurie is just going completely and totally full-on camp, which in any other scenario might seem like a clashing of tone, but as far as like even in real life, when you hear about people that had like, you know, really overbearing religious parents, and just the whole, you know, religious abuse thing, just the fact that religious abuse is a thing in general, and how people can come from, like, even if you were raised on that, you can still, you know, break out of it and be a completely different person from the people that raised you. And unfortunately, Carrie's in this scenario in the most extreme sense. So to kind of see where Carrie seems to represent, and Space's performance specifically seems to represent, this place of a teenager just kind of wanting to be a regular, like, they may have this, you know, unusual thing about them, to say the least, but she still wants to just be normal, which is what, people want to do at that age anyway, regardless if they have superpowers or not, is just to kind of fit in with everybody else. And that's something that's relatable, and Margaret is in the horror story that's going to eventually bleed into this. And what's interesting also is the book left a lot in for this performance to kind of build on. I have no idea if Lori read the book or not, but there's one particular instance that always kind of left a chill in me, which is and it's something really basic, but it's when obviously the book has a lot of like witness accounts of what happened up to and including the climax, and I think it's the neighbor talks about how once she heard Margaret shrieking, and it was literally the worst sound she had ever heard in her life. And just that alone puts all those scary elements into Margaret before we even really kind of know her. And then when we see her, first off, in the movie, when she's just at the door, she's at the Snell house, I think, and she comes in, and she seems like just, any other person going door to door doing their thing, but there's just immediately something. Like, even when she's just in the doorway, it's almost like she's creeping in the doorway, and you immediately get this sense. It kind of reminds me of when we see Kane outside the door in Poltergeist 2. Like, it gives me those kind of vibes, even though at this particular moment in the movie, if you're going in blind to the movie, you don't realize the kind of person Margaret is at this point. But there's just something, I don't know if it's, knowing after the fact or what, but there's just something really unsettling to me about this whole scene, and it's like, you can tell that she seems like she's out of place, but in a different way than Carrie is. Like where Carrie just feels like, a teenage outcast, Margaret feels out of place in the world, in this really weird way. And then, as that goes on, we get to see a lot of the style that De Palma has brought to this, where I said, obviously, Lester isn't the kind of director that De Palma is, so while Firestarter is going to be a bit more sort of straightforward, it does have the moments where it has, like, the flashbacks and stuff like that, which it kind of gets to play with the imagery a little bit when we see how the experiment goes, and how it's able to bring in horror like that. De Palma really hypnotizes us before we're really even getting into the meat of it. Because where Firestarter we're kind of in the middle of it as it starts. And so from like a story perspective, we're just kind of following it, and then we get it pieces together through the flashbacks and stuff like that. But De Palma lays everything out here, which is different from the book, where the book kind of gives us hints to what happened as we're getting the witness accounts leading up to the story itself. And getting those in between. But here, the way the tone is set is, and it could seem like, maybe he's just showing off, or maybe he's doing a little too much as the director, making himself a little too known. But I don't know, there's something, I just love the way, even in like the most mundane scenes, this movie is doing something to pull us in through its visuals. And like, or the stuff that's done, that would, in any other scene might be just subtly done, like the idea of the way Carrie reacts to Tommy's poem and how that sticks with him. And it's like, in another case, we would just kind of learn that, how Tommy felt about that, when he's at her door and saying, like, he's doing it for Sue at that time, but we get the sense that it stuck with him, that Carrie liked his poem. But the way De Palma uses the deep focus shot, where this whole scene is playing out, while Sidney Lassick, the shitty teacher, is going on and being patronizing. There's something there, just telling it through that visual kind of tells us everything. Where Carrie may not be complete, like, she may be winning people over a little bit. And there's to show that there's some people that don't see her as a complete and total pariah. Not everybody is like Chris Harrington in this scenario, thank God. But going on that also, just in general, the way a lot of the scenes at the house are shot. Because it's almost like, what's interesting about the house, the White House, is that it feels it feels really closed in all the time, but in some cases it also feels kind of huge. And it's like just kind of depending on what the scenario is, the house can either feel like this weird sort of cathedral, which is probably what Margaret would be going for. But then, and that's not even, to go into the fact that, one of the sets here is this closet that Carrie is repeatedly shut into. But just the house itself can almost feel like prison-like, or abnormally, like unsettlingly big, depending on how the scene feels and what's going on. Um, some of the cases where this stands out are like in those cases where it can feel like something is looming, even if something feels confined. Like when she's in her bedroom and she's looking in the mirror, but we see that Jesus picture that's with the lighting looks very, very sinister over her shoulder, and it's like this is what, because a lot of people that find religion use it as like a comfort. Like in any other scenario with a religious person, you would get like they would get comfort out of just having a picture of Jesus on the wall or something. But with the way Margaret has put all this together and raised her and shown her what else religion can be, depending on how it's used, if it's used as a weapon, basically, suddenly that's a terrifying image, especially with the way it's shot. And the same thing for the dinner scene with the Last Supper in the background and the storm. I really love that shot so much. And like I said, the way this dinner is building to this confrontation when she talks about having been asked to the prom, could have just been shot in a very average way, and then it was the way they behave towards each other that builds the scene up. But De Palma just starts from the get-go of this scene, where we have this really big, wide shot of them very far apart in the Last Supper, like between them, and then the way she throws the water or whatever it is at Carrie, which doesn't even seem to faze her. Like we see how she's been through this enough as it is, and it like takes the candles out, so it like just shrouds the scene in darkness. So we only have the just the other two candles remaining and the lightning, and the way it's a completely black background behind them, where the Last Supper just kind of lights up every now and then. It's like this biblical imagery goes from pictures we see all the time and that we know the context of to terrifying, and like it's sort of shutting Carrie into this world more and more, into Margaret's world more and more, and it's kind of terrifying. And then there's the stuff where we have like sometimes there's just stuff that's insignificant. Like I always love the shot of when Billy and Chris and all the others and Freddie and all them are getting to the slaughterhouse, and it just starts on that painted image. And then the way it pans back, and then they enter the shot, and then and when it pulls back, we just see how massive the slaughterhouse is and how small they look compared to it. And like I said, even stuff like that feels more or less insignificant can just add something to it. But then there's stuff where it seems like he is taking directly from the novel, where there's this particular moment when everything's starting to go to shit at the prom, needless to say, and things are getting out of control after everything has happened. And I believe the book describes it as a flickering kaleidoscope of images. And I love the fact that De Palma took that really literally when he translated it to the screen, and the way she sees the faces laughing at her, and how we see kind of the turning point of like this was the last thing that needed to happen for everything to go wrong, for everything to just snap completely. And in the same another earlier prom scene, also where it almost feels like it's building up to this chaos, is the dancing scene where it's like it's basically the happiest we've ever seen Carrie, and it's the camera is going around them. I think the thing was the camera was going one direction and they were revolving in another. And the faster this gets, because it is a very happy moment, and we see that Carrie's essentially living this dream that she never thought she'd have, or never thought she'd live. And then as it goes faster and faster, we get the sense that like it's off-putting in a way to where it's like foreshadowing that something isn't right, something is off balance, and while there's a lot of build-up to it in the novel, obviously, if you're watching the movie, you don't really know that that's what it's coming to. So that whole build-up of that really sort of spells that out, but not so spells that out nicely, if that makes sense. And another character here is the Betty Buckley character, the gym teacher, and obviously she has a very crucial role here also, to the point that you're often asking yourself where exactly it is that she lies. Because obviously she freaks out along with everybody else just because of the chaos in the shower. So it can almost seem like she's just another antagonist and another person that just treats Carrie like shit. But then you can see that there is a certain amount of care in it, and that everybody was caught up in the scenario. As Sue shows us in the opening scene, that everybody just got caught up in that whole thing. But then there's the interactions with the principal, where it's like she's still that authority figure, and obviously all the other authority figures are sort of like put in a distance. There is this whole thing in the novel that's not in the movie that I always liked, where it was when Chris Arkanson's dad is coming in and like talking about like suing the school and stuff like that because she got hit, and then Carrie gets brought into it, and the way that Carrie actually gets defended in that scene by like the other authority figures, it showed, like I was talking about, where it's like she's not the pariah you'd be led to believe if you're looking at, you know, the other girls, but there's still just enough here that there's enough of a distance that she's going to feel really alienated and unloved, which is going to lead to everything else. That on top of, you know, having to live with Margaret is not going to help that at all. So the only other real figure, the closest thing to this maternal figure that she has, is the Betty Buckley character, and we get to like her for a number of reasons, because she does eventually get protective of Carrie, and there is the great scene when she's the one that gives her the encouragement about the fact that she was asked to prom, and she thinks it might be a trick, but she kind of convinces her that this is a really good thing, and then they talk about how they can change her look and stuff like that, and then there's that shot where the camera kind of comes in close on her, and we can see her expression change, where it's like she figures this, like she's being optimistic for Carrie's sake, but this could be a setup of some sort, and the way that the expression just sort of changes, and then that immediate cut to Tommy and Sue in the office with her, and she's interrogating them. And it's like the way this is told visually like that is really well done, because this is a lot of stuff that could have easily just been done in dialogue, but would have felt like, you know, this sort of painful exposition that we don't really need. And I love the way that's handled too. How De Palma seems to really not be afraid to just tell things visually without exposition. So I love that we have the introduction of Billy into the story, where we see him and Chris, you know, driving around and doing their whole thing, and she's going to try to talk him into doing this prank. And this is cutting back and forth between Tommy and Sue scenes, and it's like we can see the different couples and where they're coming from, the innocent and then the very, very guilty eventually. But the way they do this is in between cutting back and forth, we get the scene where she tells Tommy, I want you to ask Carrie to the prom, and then that second cut after our Billy and Chris scene is just like him thinking for a long time. There's just like no dialogue between them. He's just watching that show with James Garner, and then just says that he will. And we get the sense that, like, because I know that that was something that a lot of people like kind of saw as a bit of a stretch, like in the novel or the movie. Sue's whole plan of basically atoning for what she did in the locker room to have Tommy do this. And I love that there's like a full debate on it in the book, where like the adults are talking and saying, in retrospect, like, you know, is it really, like, would a girl Sue's age, like, you know, have the capacity to want to atone and to do something like that to do so? And how they have whole conspiracies about, like, how they say that Tommy's basically like a Lee Harvey Oswald figure, where nobody knows, like, it appears he had a very specific thing, but it's like there's all these other theories of why he could have, what part he played in this exactly. Which is an interesting thing that the book goes into, but obviously the movie is so sort of emotion-based that, you know, we can just, that's like strictly novel stuff that we don't need here, as great as it is by itself. But another thing that's great here about the Betty Buckley character is how she kind of gives us a sort of not like an instant gratification, but just enough before we get to the meat of the story and what kind of eventually sets off the story, where we get to see her punish everybody that partook in the whole shower thing, and how we get to see her like really put Chris in her place early, where we get the whole montage of them on the field, and this that has this very high 70s energy in this really great way. Like I said, it feels like this movie should be a tonal nightmare, but honestly, it just all kind of works for me somehow. Like somehow all these pieces that have nothing to do with each other somehow fit together to tell this really bizarre story in this really unique way, where all of that comes out. And what's really interesting about the end of this scene, when Chris eventually gets slapped and we're all better off for it, everything's just kind of just beginning, and it's interesting that this becomes a revenge movie like twice over, where obviously eventually the big revenge from our main character is going to happen, but this is all sort of stems from one of our antagonistic characters looking for revenge, which is usually stuff that comes in different parts of the story, in a usual story with these elements. And so what's interesting about this that the movie does, that kind of differentiates it from the book just a little bit, was having Chris be so revenge-driven, specifically, like to a very personal degree. Because if I remember correctly, Billy does like all the dirty work in the book, where it's like he goes to the slaughterhouse, but she doesn't. Where it's just she just kind of asks him and then he does it. And then there's this whole other scenario going on that we don't get really anything of in the movie, which is the relationship between Chris and Billy, where it kind of seems like in the movie Chris kind of has more control. Like he tries to like slap her around and stuff like that, but the way that she still seems to have some sort of power over him, whereas in the book they go into this whole thing about how the way she's drawn to him in this almost supernatural way, and how like the way she's attracted to his car, where like it unsettles her, but she's also like drawn to it. It's almost like there's early echoes of Christine before Christine happened. And I always thought that especially eerie, how she builds up how it's the car unsettles her, and it's like it's the car that she dies in, which is never really said explicitly, but is obviously there, and that in itself is kind of creepy. But the main thing is that it's like her attraction to Billy and that whole thing. But to have her in the movie not only seem to be driving this whole thing, but also going to the slaughterhouse and gleefully cheering Billy on as he's killing the pigs, it really makes it sort of a personal thing, a much more personal thing with Chris, I think, than the novel let on. Which makes all that a bit more interesting. And then, obviously, when we get to the prom, we get symbolism galore, I guess you could say. Where we get the big prank scene that is now one of the most iconic scenes in movie history, not just horror movies, but in general, where the blood comes down on her. And then, like I was talking about, you can basically take this as a number of things. I don't know how much symbolism is actually intended, but I feel like there's a lot you can take away from it. Because there's the whole thing, obviously, of one of the things that really started this off was the shower scene, when she had her period for the first time, and it freaked her out. And how just the sight of blood in general, like I said, you can take this into a whole teenage allegory as well. Talking about this traumatizing experience, and it's like the sight of blood in general is what started this, and what kind of started her descent also with how Margaret sees her, with the whole becoming a woman thing, and then next is boys and her whole insane thing. And so now it feels weirdly symbolic that it's blood, of all things, that is dropped on her. And, of course, it rains down on her like a shower. So it's like it's all just coming back to that, and the laughter that she hears, like, it does seem like there's kind of a small group actually laughing at her, and everybody else that she sees through, like, the kaleidoscopic imagery is just kind of, in her head, she's imagining it's everybody, like it was in the shower. And so there's that whole thing coming back. And then I guess you could say there's a sort of revenge shower, where it was Carrie in the shower and then everybody overwhelming around her. And now one of her weapons of choice, her first weapon of choice, is the fire hose. And this was a bit more of like an apparent analogy in the book, because in the book it talks about the sprinklers coming on. But it still feels like, the use of water, of all things, seems intentional, given where the movie started, where the first big traumatic experience was, that seemed to really set everything off. And and the fact and it's like, despite how prominent fire eventually becomes, the fact that the water is essentially what started it, because they're electrical fires. So there could be something there. Like I said, I don't know how much of that would be intended or could be intended, but it's something that I think about when I see it, I guess. And then eventually this gets to our it's implied that nobody came out of the school that was still in there, and this is essentially, especially in the book, they kind of talk about the fact that this whole event basically became like the 9/11 of this town. Hence all the conspiracies around it that the book goes into. But naturally we're going to have the remaining people. Because at the end of it, obviously this is like a revenge movie for many people. But what's interesting is the way the movie changes from the book, where like it gives you the idea of... It's funny, we were talking about the fact that Mark L. Lester did Commando. The idea of killing somebody last in a revenge type way, and it's like you get the idea of whoever the revenge is really about, like whoever is like the prime antagonist here is going to be the one that goes last. And what's interesting is, between the book and the movie, that is two different people, or two different sets of people, I guess you could say. Where, if I remember correctly, in the book, she leaves the school, she goes home, she kills her mom, then she tracks down Chris and Billy and kills them, and then that's where she just kind of flops down and dies. And so that kind of sets up that thing where it's like, it's interesting that it feels like the movie made it more personal from a Chris perspective, given that Chris is the last one to die in the book, to make it seem like Chris was kind of the main focus all along. But like I was saying at the beginning, I've always seen it as Margaret is the main antagonist of this whole story. If you want to talk about where it all comes from, that's clearly where it is, and there is a whole, big confrontation here, and it's, once again, I don't know if I'm taking this in a different way than intended, but I always found it quite interesting that, as she is killing, like, obviously the obvious one is that she's, got Margaret pinned like the statue in the closet, but the thing about this also is that Margaret goes on this whole big thing about how Carrie was conceived, and this whole thing about basically making sex sound like the absolute worst thing in the entire world, and like something that is like, done to you rather than something you experience with somebody else, and that there was like this sort of, I can't remember. I'm kind of getting lost in between the book and the movie now, but I can't remember if like rape may have been implied, or stated explicitly. I don't, my memory's vague on that. But the thing that I take away from this is that Margaret is being killed by repeated penetration, and maybe my mind's going in a weird place, but her dying moans almost seem orgasmic as she's dying. Am I the only one hearing that? Or so I feel like there's something there also in the way that Margaret has built up through the whole movie, that's just the absolute worst thing. Like, that's why Carrie getting her period for the first time was the worst thing ever, was that would be the next thing, and then for that to be essentially Margaret's fate, which one thing could absolutely just be a De Palma thing, which would not surprise me at all. And then obviously after this happens, and Carrie tragically dies as well, because it is obviously a very tragic story at the end of all this, despite Carrie seeming monster-like by the end of this, and how many innocent people were in the school, but how it was all sort of pushed to this, like Chris and Billy kind of pushed that button. It's like it's like somebody detonating a bomb and people getting mad at the bomb, if you consider Carrie the antagonist. So the thing here that we end on is this jump scare. That's obviously a very cinematic moment, and kind of one of like the first instances of something like this. Like, we got a couple of jump scenes in Jaws just the year before, but this one in particular, to my understanding, was quite unheard of at the time. It was like one of the, like, of all the things that happened in this movie, and how at the end, you know, the final jump scare, especially the arm out of the grave thing, is just such a cliche at this point that it's easy to forget that it had a starting point, and there were people that were seeing that kind of scare for the first time, and it was like, it's the only thing you would talk about coming away from it. And it was the thing where it's like, I think I remember also, like, the producers or something would go into showings of the movie just to see the reactions to that. And it was always, like, enormous, and it was, like, the whole selling point of people leaving the theater and telling other people to see this. Yeah, but what's interesting about this, though, at the end of the day, is talking about, you know, Carrie being the destructive force here, is when you're talking about, you know, human versus monster and stuff like that. Yeah, Carrie's the one causing all the havoc and the death and the destruction and stuff like that. But Carrie is also extremely fictional, and her powers are extremely fictional. The terrifying thing about this movie is that the Margaret Whites and the Billy Nolans and the Chris Argensons are real. They're out there somewhere, and there's many of them. There's too many of them to count. And they are harming people like Carrie, who can't defend themselves with superpowers. Just, you know, probably thousands and thousands of times a day, with how many there are. And that, I feel like, is kind of the main takeaway from Carrie, despite the fact that it is, you know, a very traditionally, you know, horror story, with, you know, a death machine at the middle of it. But once again, it's all about whether or not you're made to be that way. And somebody else who I've barely touched on up to this point was also made into one of these sort of unwilling destructive machines. And that would be Charlie McGee, who is Drew Barrymore in Firestarter. And going on this, obviously, like I was talking about, we do get our back and forth, and we kind of are just thrown into the story immediately. And yeah, this one kind of sets up that it might not be as emotionally driven. It is very sort of like, it has a humanity at its center, and we're meant to approach the characters in this very sort of humane way and see them that way. And eventually we are going to get an antagonist or two that have no superpowers whatsoever, but are the thing to be scared of, and the thing that could be out there in real life, which we'll get to. But for starters, this is all brought about by a doctor, Wanless, played by Freddie Jones, and yeah, as far as it having this sort of traditional feel, yeah, I do kind of like the almost camp idea of having Freddie Jones look like an actual mad scientist at the start of this, when we're getting, and everything seems, you know, relatively normal. David Keith is here, who we've seen in the opening season, and Heather Locklear is here, and there's like a love story blooming here that could basically have been its own movie, was this story of them and how, you know, they go through this test and eventually get these powers of sorts, but then they make the choice to have a baby, and of course that baby is going to be born with all this other stuff that's been going on. And mainly she can start fires with her mind, which is going to be, and when you're talking about a child and how hard a child can be to control anyway, obviously this is a very interesting setup. And obviously the book goes into a lot more about how, you know, she was as a baby and stuff like that, and dealing with it with that. But we already have a nearly 2-hour movie here, so there's going to have to be some stuff that's cut down. If anything, the movie's problem is that they probably didn't take out enough, but we'll get to that point also. What's interesting about this is that, talking about that thing that King has, where he can take a fantastical situation and put a fear in it that comes from a real place. So here, while we do have all this stuff, there is that idea of, like, you know, constantly feeling like you're being followed, or constantly feeling like you're being watched, and a lot of that whole sort of paranoia aspect plays a big part in the sort of creep factor into this movie. Because while we were talking about how Carrie is very traditionally horror, like, you see Carrie, and somebody says, what kind of movie was that? You would say horror, no question. Firestarter doesn't feel like... It's always been interesting to me that Firestarter is classified as horror. Because I mean, I guess you could say sci-fi, but there's still something, like, there is a certain sort of creep element in it that's kind of lingering, but is only, like, the stuff that's really at the foreground is the stuff that's happening to Charlie. And of course, Charlie's not going to be a character that we're afraid of, but other characters, like the scene when we're on the farm, and they're really building up, what she's capable of, and then when we actually see it, and it's like it's one thing where it's like, oh, we see, Heather Locklear's emits catch fire, and we can see that has the ability to lose control of it, and that would be bad if she did. But we never really quite get, because there's such an innocence to Charlie in the way Barrymore plays her, it never really gets in our minds how bad, like, what it would look like if something, like, until we get to the scene on the farm, when the guy is completely engulfed in flames all the way down to the charred bone, and then we realize, oh, that's what she's capable of, okay? And it's like, that scene helps that set in, and then it becomes this whole thing where we get the sense of danger throughout it. But what's interesting about that also is the way they play up pretty much constantly, like almost to a redundant state, Charlie's guilt about having to do this, and every time she does it, because obviously we see her sort of impromptu training in the kitchen, and so she's obviously scolded, but she's scolded in the way that a parent would scold you, where, like, you do something that you're not supposed to, only in this case it's starting fires with your mind and potentially, harming your mother a lot, like, in a very bad way. But the way she's been trained that way, the way any child will be trained to not do something they're not supposed to, she'll do this terrible thing that could kill somebody, and then has to, cry and say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Like a child would if they knocked over a vase. And there's like a depth in there, for sure. And like I said, the fact that eventually she has to kill people, to be safe, for them to be safe, and how that whole ordeal and how they go into that. I guess they don't go into it as much as they could. They just kind of really play it up by having her continuously say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. And she kind of has the same reaction, but that's obviously more in, like, the direction, where Barrymore was capable of more than that, but they didn't quite give her, like, more to bite off of that. But it's talking about the way we can really see just how lived in her guilt is, and the way that she is capable of the stuff that we haven't seen yet, that we won't see until, the guy is completely burned down. And right before that, we kind of get this warning that she plays off really well when the suits show up, and then Art Carney says, I'm going to get my gun, and just the way she delivers, you don't need your gun, is so ominous. And I said perfectly sets up what we eventually see, and what we see that she actually is capable of, and that she is actually potentially deadly, despite how hard that might be to wrap your head around when we see her, setting the dude's boots on fire, or an arm here and there, and how it's... And this, obviously all of this is just build up until we get to the climax, which is fucking insane. But in the meantime, we do have stuff here that's great as far as build up, where we have, like I was talking about, fear that comes from a real place. Like the scene when Heather Locklear is killed off screen, and David Keith finds her, and he goes to that closet that has the blood underneath it, and he stops before he opens it, and he says, like, please don't be in here. And, like, I think we've all had that feeling at some point, in whatever context, where it's like there's something that we really, really don't want to be true, but it's really vivid in our minds, and the worst possible thing is for it to be revealed that it is. And so it's like, with this being a movie, when he stops at the doors and you hear him say, please don't be in here, since we're in a movie, we can anticipate he would open the doors and nothing would be there. That's what we would come to expect. So when her body actually does drop out, it's quite startling and jarring, and terrifying. But there's also a lot of cases in this movie, more so, where they kind of missed the boat on the tension. And there's plenty that the book gave them. Like, one sequence I really love in the book, that I could really see working as a sequence in the movie, is when he has to, after he discovers his wife's body, and he has to track down where Charlie is. And so he just kind of has to drive around for a while until he spots them, and then once he spots them, he has to follow them, and then when they get to the location, then the whole thing happens. Like, I could see that being a whole sort of tense situation here that would kind of go along with the sort of paranoid feel. Like, it would feel like one of those movies, and the way that this movie kind of sets up itself to be with the guys from the shop kind of feeling like this looming presence. But we just cut, and she's like at the friend's house, and they're just taking her, and it's like all that tension we could have had is just sort of gone, and then all that leftover runtime we have is put into the second half, which isn't, to me, isn't quite as enticing as when they're on the run. But that could just be me. But yeah, eventually we do get an antagonist, because that's basically what the missing piece here is we have the tension, and more importantly, what could have been the tension, and then we have the stuff where they're just running tests on them repeatedly for the entire second half of the movie. There needs to be like one more factor in here. And while we do have an antagonist of sorts with Martin Sheen, who's kind of running this whole thing, it's clear that we're dealing with what is essentially a horror story at its core, I guess. So we need an appropriate antagonist for that. We need a scary antagonist. So they bring in, and while Rainbird, I believe, is like Native American in the book, I can very much get behind the casting of George C. Scott as far as like making a terrifying villain and somebody who is very threatening, not just like in their, not like what they are physically capable of, which it's clearly a lot here, as we see when he just kills Wallace by punching him once. That really sets up just how deadly he is. But just his presence in general is really intimidating. If there's something that I think they could have done more was, I remember the book building him up a lot. Like, we have the whole thing where, like, Hollister's sort of sitting in his office, and we get a lot of talk about Rainbird, and he's really, really built up, and then when he finally comes in, and it's like, when Hollister shows up, and he's just kind of already in the office, it feels like we were kind of robbed of that sort of build-up. This is stuff that I feel like could have fit in the runtime. They just kind of devoted a little too much time to things that really didn't need it, unfortunately. But as they build this up, when Rainbird says that in that very sinister way, you know, she and I are going to be close, and he's like looking at the picture. And maybe I'm mistaken, but it's been a little bit since I read the book, but if I remember correctly, the movie seems to be taking more of the approach of, like, there's almost, like, they're kind of trying to make him a creeper of sorts in regards to his obsession with Charlie. And if I remember correctly, in the book, it's more of, like, he even, like, addresses, like, you know, that's, you know, even if it sounds like that, really he's just drunk on her power, and wants that for himself. But honestly, in both cases, Rainbird's motives are vague. It feels like even with as much description as King puts into his characters and everything, Rainbird's motives always kind of felt a little vague in this story from either standpoint. But going on that also, as far as like any other motivation, there's also something here with Hollister that's missing that was in the book, where that guy that burns to death on the farm was like, there was almost like this whole, the book kind of eventually abandoned it, I think, but they kind of set up, there was this bit of revenge angle from him where, like, Hollister was really, really upset about that guy dying, and it's like, when he started going after them, there was, like, a bit more, like, bitterness in it, like it was some sort of revenge mission on top of that for that dude's death, but it's not present in the movie at all. But I will say, which I guess is clear, obviously I am, like, a really, really massive King fan, as you've seen from the million videos we've done on him in the past couple of years. I don't know if this is controversial or not, but Firestarter I never thought was one of his stronger books. He's got a lot of strong elements in it, and some great stuff here, but there's also a lot of, it is one of his more exposition-heavy books, and it's one of those where he does a little too much explaining about the concept itself and, like, the science of it, when we basically kind of get the vibe. But we have these very long scenes in the book where it's Wanless and Hollister talking about it, and it's like King was trying to play a game with himself. How many times he could put pituitary into a page, and it becomes really redundant. It's going in circles. And they start in with the analogies after we get it, like after they fully explained it, and then they start doing this game to see like who can have, the more appropriate analogy or something. And it just feels like it goes on and on and on. And the scenes in the movie, there's only one scene of that conversation in the movie, and it kind of has that vibe, but not near as it's condensed. But if you were to just watch the movie, it would also kind of feel like it'd be hard to imagine this is the condensed version of this conversation. It's very there's they explain a little more than they had to, I think, but I do also obviously realize that that's King's thing. Um, like even if you love the King exposition and you love the way he's able to go on tangents and just get down to every last detail of things that are even like side thoughts that only like somewhat relate to what's going on here in the main story. But even his tangents in the book feel like they're a little like you want to tell him to focus just a little more. And it's like I think the book is like 400 pages. It's it could have you could probably lob at least 100 out of that. Um, and have a much more tighter story. I also think something that the movie sort of added that was a little better was David Keith's performance, which he's not given a lot, but he has just enough of that where it's like you can sense the desperation and the paranoia, and then the scenes where he has to play the stern dad, where it's like he has to punish her for these, powers in the way that you would punish a normal child for doing a normal thing, which he plays very well. And then just in general, when they're like just kind of the father and daughter, when they're like fishing and stuff like that, I feel like he hits all the right notes with those. But like I was saying, the thing is that he doesn't really have much to work with, because in the book, Andy is not real. Like, Andy is basically our central protagonist apart from Charlie, and there's just really nothing interesting about that character. Like, it's literally just him having to protect Charlie is basically the only thing he has going on. The whole love story is fine, and there is something there, and we feel the tragedy of it when she's eventually killed, but it's a little too short-lived for a story that goes on for as long as it does. And like I said, a lot of this is drained when we do get to the middle portion here, when they get taken in. And while that's a great sequence where you see all, like, the silver suits come out of the woods, and we see, like, the way the scene is set up where it looks like Rainbird's working alone, and then just, like, 20 or 30 or 40 people just kind of come out, is a really great scene. And I love the way those shots, like, linger, too, without a lot of cutting. But then the second we're at the shop, and maybe this is just me, but in the book especially, like, George C. Scott's performance is able to keep it lively throughout the movie, but especially in the book, it feels like once we get to the shop, this story just grinds to an absolute halt, and just stops and gets, like, really repetitive for a long time. And even when it's not being repetitive, it's just like it has stopped completely. And that's where I feel like there is something to this story and something great in this story, but that's always where it's kind of lost me. And maybe a lot of people don't feel that way, but because I know this is a very beloved book in his whole library, but I don't know, this second half I always felt like was kind of a struggle, and the movie, like I said, the movie livens it up a little bit with some of the performances, but overall it is kind of the same vibe, where it's when we finally get to the climax and we see just how big the climax is, it's clear that it's like the movie was just killing time till it could show off its climax. Like, I feel like the whole movie was greenlit to begin with, not necessarily just because King would sell, but because it's like, so we can put that scene on film, and it's like whatever happens to come in between, we'll figure out as we go. We'll figure out how to adapt that as we go along. But it feels like it's all just sort of building to its climax without much thought into what's happening until then. Because everything before they go to the shop, like when they're on, the Manders farm and stuff like that, and those interactions, and how it makes sense because there's that really, like, sort of instantaneous connection between them. But Art Carney's performance especially is so sincere and, like, real and authentic.
that we immediately get this sort of grandfatherly vibe from him, and that's a nice payoff when the ending comes back around, and that's where she goes back to when she no longer has Andy. Um, but like I was saying, it was all about getting to this ending and this big explosive climax, where everybody gets wiped out. She's able to just shoot fireballs now, and it's and that whole thing and how it gets bigger and bigger. And what's interesting though is when you look at like Carrie, where like all these people were people that we knew, and they were like, you know, some of them may have been innocents and some of them certainly were not. But there was this real tragic element to it, and obviously here, um, we don't we don't know, you know, the Shaw people. We know enough about what goes on here that it's like basically they're expendable. It's like, yeah, just take them out, you know. They're just obstacles. So it does feel like there's two different approaches here in regards to that. But the thing about it is, with Carrie, it's a very, very gradual build up to what that is, that whole climax, and seeing all that happen to those faces that we know. And Firestar, like I said, is basically just killing time until we get there. So, yeah. But, I mean, it's still a really, really big climax and a very, very cool scene. Even if, you know, some of the effects seem a bit dated, like the fireballs and stuff like that, still, like, the dude, like, catching fire and then flying off into the tree and stuff like that, and then, you know, blowing up the whole place. It is a very, very satisfying scene, and it is worth the build-up, but you kind of wish they'd put more into the build-up a little bit. Or at least made it feel like we were building to something. Like, I was talking about the scene in Carrie where it's like, even the dancing scene, when everybody's happy, feels like there's something's about to go off. And like I said, with Firestarter, there's just really no feel of build-up. We're just kind of waiting. And, like, even stuff they throw in there, like Necromancer and stuff like that, is build-up to, like, oh, it's the reason she can't, you know, immediately burn the barn down. And it's a lot of build up for these tiny little payoffs, that are really just building up to the big payoff, which is all the fire. So, yeah. Um, so yeah. So obviously, in total, whether we're talking about just the books or just the movies, I'm just all about Carrie. I think Carrie is just so incredibly well done as both a story and how De Palma was able to bring it to the screen in his own way, but yet somehow, some way, was able to make his style tell this story that felt really human and tragic, despite having much more of the, you know, not quite getting into the down into the humanity that the book might be able to, where we can get more into the characters. But yeah, so, and obviously Firestarter is great for a while, but I do think that second half really brings it down in this way, and there could have been a bit more to the whole, you know, them trying to figure out how they were going to escape and stuff like that, because the whole interactions with Andy and Hollister are obviously significantly cut down for the movie. But like I said, there's a lot of stuff I feel like in the second half you could have cut down and given more time to the stuff that would have been, you know, more involving. But as is, you know, that's where we are. So I think that's going to be it for this one. So we're going to continue on. We're going to do a lot more of these. We're not done with King yet, as you can probably guess. And we're going to have new releases and franchises and trilogies and stuff like that. A whole month of the horror stuff and other stuff like that. We've got Bond coming, we've got Halloween coming, all that stuff. Edgar Wright at the end of the month. It should be fun. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.